In 2023, a Chinese city rolled out thousands of new 5G base stations in less time than it can take an American infrastructure project to finish its environmental review paperwork. That's not a joke. Well, it is a little bit of a joke. Just not a particularly funny one if you're responsible for national competitiveness. Because somewhere between inventing technologies and actually building things, the United States developed a strange habit: studying problems longer than some countries take to solve them. And this matters far beyond your phone signal. The country that deploys new technologies first doesn't just get faster internet, it learns first. It develops new business models first. It trains engineers first. It creates supply chains first. Then, very quietly, it starts setting the standards everyone else has to live with. The numbers here are difficult to ignore. By the end of 2024, China had built more than 4 million 5G base stations, according to data from its Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. That is more than the rest of the world combined. Pause on that for a second. More than the rest of the world combined. Meanwhile, the United States is still debating how much 5G equipment should be built, where it should go, who should pay for it, and which federal agency should coordinate with which state authority to issue permits. Those questions are reasonable individually. Collectively, they can become a kind of national paralysis. The easy explanation is to say this is authoritarian efficiency versus democratic messiness. That's part of it, but I think it's too simple. Because if this were only about political systems, America wouldn't have built the interstate highway system in 35 years. It wouldn't have sent astronauts to the moon 8 years after President Kennedy's speech. It wouldn't have produced Liberty ships during World War II at a pace that still seems almost fictional. The United States used to be frighteningly good at building things quickly. Something changed. And the story of Chinese 5G deployment is really a story about that change. Take one city, Shenzhen, a place of around 18 million people. 40 years ago, it was a fishing community. Today, it has one of the world's densest digital infrastructures and became among the first major cities to achieve near-universal standalone 5G coverage. 18 million people, that's roughly the population of New York State. Imagine upgrading digital infrastructure across an area with that many people in a matter of months. Then imagine scheduling meetings to discuss whether that pace is feasible. Different worlds. What China discovered, perhaps accidentally at first, is that deployment itself creates advantages that cannot be replicated in laboratories. When millions of people use a technology at scale, problems appear faster, solutions emerge faster, companies iterate faster. This is why Chinese firms such as Huawei and ZTE accumulated enormous experience in network deployment. They weren't necessarily inventing every foundational technology. They were installing, operating, and improving systems at a speed few competitors could match. There's a phrase in manufacturing, learning by doing. Countries do that too. And this is where the story stops being about telecom towers. Artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, industrial robotics, smart grids, advanced manufacturing, almost every strategic technology of the next 20 years depends less on who writes the first paper and more on who can deploy systems across entire societies. The rewards go to the builders, which raises an uncomfortable question. If America still possesses world-class universities, the deepest capital markets on Earth, and many of the most innovative companies ever created, why is it increasingly struggling to turn decisions into concrete, steel, fiber optic cable, and functioning infrastructure? I don't think the answer is bureaucracy alone. Remember that number from earlier? 4 million 5G base stations. We'll come back to it because that figure hides something even more significant than China's telecom ambitions. It reveals a new kind of geopolitical competition, one measured not just by inventions or military power, but by something far more mundane and perhaps more decisive. The number of months between deciding to build something and actually building it. That gap between decision and execution has a name in economics, although people rarely talk about it outside policy circles. State capacity. It sounds academic. It isn't. State capacity is simply the ability of a country to make decisions and then turn those decisions into reality. Roads, ports, power grids, data centers, semiconductor fabs, transmission lines, even housing. A nation can be rich and still be terrible at this. In fact, wealth sometimes hides the problem for years. The United States still has extraordinary strengths. It remains the center of global finance. Its universities attract talent from almost every country on Earth. It leads in frontier AI models, aerospace, and advanced semiconductor design. But there's a growing disconnect between invention and implementation. Look at high-speed rail. China's first true high-speed line opened in 2008. Today, the country operates over 45,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, more than two-thirds of the global total. The United States, meanwhile, has spent decades discussing projects that still exist mostly in presentations, legal disputes, and revised timelines. This isn't because American engineers forgot how to build trains. It's because modern America has become exceptionally good at adding layers between the idea and the execution. Environmental reviews, local approvals, federal approvals, judicial challenges, procurement disputes, public consultations, additional studies of previous studies. Each layer often has a perfectly rational justification. Together they create friction, and friction compounds. The funny thing is that China has bureaucracy too, a lot of it. Beijing is not some magical machine where every official wakes up and immediately starts pouring concrete. But when the central government decides that something matters, the entire system tends to align around that objective. In 2019, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology issued commercial 5G licenses. Provincial governments incorporated 5G deployment targets into development plans. State-owned telecom operators, China Mobile, China Telecom, and China Unicom began building at enormous scale. Banks financed it. Local governments facilitated it. Equipment suppliers expanded production. Universities increased relevant training programs. The entire ecosystem moved in roughly the same direction. You can criticize the model, many do, and some criticisms are entirely fair. But you cannot say it doesn't produce infrastructure, and infrastructure has a strange habit of creating second-order effects. Think about autonomous vehicles. An autonomous vehicle isn't just a car with better software. It depends on sensors, cloud computing, ultra-fast communications, high-quality mapping, and enormous quantities of data. Deploy enough 5G networks, and you create a giant laboratory for testing connected systems. Deploy enough smart factories, and your manufacturers become more productive. Deploy enough industrial robots, and your engineers gain experience no textbook can provide. Again and again, scale turns into expertise. There's a reason Chinese companies file enormous numbers of patents in telecommunications and industrial technologies. The deployment itself teaches them things. I keep coming back to that because it changes how we think about competition. For years, many people in Washington assumed that because America invented many of the foundational technologies, it would naturally dominate the industries built on top of them. History doesn't really support that assumption. The United States invented much of modern consumer electronics. Japan became an electronics powerhouse. Europe pioneered many mobile technologies. American firms eventually dominated the internet economy. Britain invented the steam engine. Industrial supremacy crossed borders. Innovation and industrial leadership are related, but they're not married. Sometimes they don't even live in the same house. And there is a more immediate consequence. When a country becomes the first large-scale user of a technology, companies around the world start designing products for that market. Standards begin to shift. Talent moves. Capital follows. Supply chains rearrange themselves. Very slowly, then all at once. I think this is the piece many analysts miss when discussing Chinese infrastructure. They focus on whether a particular project makes money in the short term. That's not always the point. The first transcontinental railroads didn't make every investor rich. The interstate highway system wasn't justified because every mile generated immediate profit. Some infrastructure changes the geometry of an economy. China appears to understand this instinctively. The question is whether the United States still does. Because if this is merely a story about telecom towers, it's interesting. If it's actually a story about national capability, about whether advanced democracies can still build and deploy at speed, then it's much bigger than 5G. And this is where things become uncomfortable for both sides of the argument, because the numbers that make China look unstoppable also hide some very serious weaknesses. And one of them could determine whether this entire model keeps working over the next decade. At this point, it's tempting to split into camps. One side says China has figured out the future, build fast, deploy fast, iterate fast, and everyone else can hold meetings about it. The other side argues that much of this infrastructure is inefficient, debt-fueled, and ultimately unsustainable. Both camps have evidence, and both are incomplete, because those 4 million 5G base stations we talked about earlier carry another number behind them: Money, a lot of it. Chinese telecom operators have spent hundreds of billions of yuan building networks, upgrading equipment, and expanding coverage. The returns have not always matched the investment. Several industry reports over the past few years have noted that average revenue per user hasn't exploded simply because consumers have access to 5G. People mostly use faster networks to do exactly what they were doing before: watch videos, scroll social media, send messages. Humanity received one of the most advanced communications networks ever built and collectively decided to use it to argue in comment sections. That is, admittedly, very on brand for our species. The criticism from American analysts isn't entirely wrong. Infrastructure can be overbuilt. Local governments in China have accumulated heavy debt burdens. Some projects have generated less economic activity than planners expected. The Chinese model carries risks. But then comes the reversal, because even if some of the infrastructure turns out to be excessive, the capabilities built during the process remain. The engineers still learned. The suppliers still expanded. The equipment manufacturers still gained experience. The software companies still tested products at scale. The country still accumulated know-how. This matters more than it appears. Consider shipbuilding. In the early 2000s, many analysts argued that China was producing too much industrial capacity. Today, Chinese shipyards account for more than half of global commercial shipbuilding output. Or solar panels. For years, critics described Chinese solar manufacturing as a subsidy-driven bubble. Today, China dominates the global solar supply chain, from polysilicon processing to module production. The same pattern appears again and again. Build more capacity than immediately necessary, learn from the process, drive costs down, then become difficult to compete against. I am not saying this strategy always succeeds. It doesn't. There are failed industrial policies scattered across every major economy. But dismissing Chinese overbuilding as simple waste misses something important. Excess capacity can function like a training program for an entire industrial ecosystem. And that brings us back to the United States. America's challenge isn't a lack of innovation. If anything, it still produces an astonishing number of breakthroughs. The challenge is that its deployment machinery has become slow, fragmented, and increasingly expensive. Take transmission lines for electricity. The United States wants more data centers, more electric vehicles, more semiconductor fabs, and more AI infrastructure. All of those require enormous quantities of power. Yet building new transmission infrastructure can take over a decade between planning and completion. A decade. That's long enough for entire industries to appear or disappear. A semiconductor plant approved today could be operating before the power lines needed to support future facilities receive all their permits. You start to see the issue. This isn't really about whether China is better at innovation or whether America is richer or freer. It's about time. Time between decision and action. Time between invention and deployment. Time between recognizing a strategic challenge and responding to it. Great powers often decline gradually in material terms, but they also decline procedurally. They become slower at turning intention into reality. I don't know if the United States has reached that point. I'm genuinely uncertain. The country still possesses extraordinary reserves of talent, capital, and institutional strength, but the delays are becoming impossible to ignore. And here's the question I keep coming back to. What happens when technologies themselves begin moving faster than the institutions responsible for deploying them? Artificial intelligence is advancing in months. Energy demand from data centers is exploding. Robotics is accelerating. Space infrastructure is becoming strategically important. If your decision-making machinery takes years to adapt, you may discover that the future has already been built somewhere else. Not because your scientists failed, because your calendars did. And that possibility leads to a prediction I think many people still underestimate. The competition between China and the United States over the next decade may not be won by the country with the best ideas. It may be won by the country that can turn good ideas into physical systems before the other one finishes debating the paperwork. I think we've been using the wrong scoreboard. For years, analysts obsessed over who publishes more papers, who files more patents, who graduates more engineers, who spends more on research and development. Those things matter, but increasingly, I suspect the decisive metric is much simpler. How long does it take your country to do something? Not announce it, not fund a study about it, actually do it. That may sound almost insultingly basic, yet history keeps pointing in this direction. The British Empire didn't dominate the 19th century because it had the best ideas alone. It built ports, telegraph cables, railways, and shipyards across the world. The United States didn't become the defining power of the 20th century merely by inventing technologies. It built highways, airports, power stations, universities, and industrial networks at a pace that transformed a continent-sized economy. Capacity became power, and power reinforced capacity. China appears to have internalized that lesson. Its leaders speak constantly about new productive forces and industrial modernization. The language can sound bureaucratic, but the underlying idea is straightforward. Deploy infrastructure first and allow industries to grow on top of it. Sometimes that will produce waste. Sometimes it will produce excess capacity. Sometimes entire projects will fail. The Chinese system makes mistakes at scale because it attempts things at scale. The American system increasingly avoids mistakes by making it difficult to attempt anything at scale. Those are different kinds of risks. And I don't think either country has found the perfect balance. America's strengths are real and substantial. Its research universities remain extraordinary. Venture capital still concentrates there. The dollar still sits at the center of global finance. The world's best talent continues to move to the United States in remarkable numbers. People writing America's obituary are getting ahead of themselves. At the same time, pretending there isn't a state capacity problem feels increasingly detached from reality. A country that took roughly 8 years to go from Kennedy's speech to the moon now struggles to build a few miles of rail or permit transmission lines in a reasonable time frame. That deserves serious reflection. Because the technologies arriving over the next decade don't wait patiently. Artificial intelligence requires data centers. Data centers require electricity. Electricity requires transmission infrastructure. Advanced manufacturing requires industrial sites, ports, logistics, and skilled workers. These are physical systems. You cannot download them. Here's my opinion. I think the United States is entering a period of uncomfortable self-discovery. Not decline, not collapse, something more specific. It is beginning to realize that being excellent at inventing the future is not enough if another country becomes better at installing it. And here's my doubt. Can a large democracy recover its ability to build quickly without sacrificing the checks, legal protections, and local input that many citizens rightly value? I genuinely don't know. The answer may determine far more than who wins the 5G race. My prediction is this. By the early 2030s, deployment speed will become a central measure of national power, discussed in the same way we discuss GDP or military spending today. Governments will start tracking how long it takes to build data centers, power infrastructure, factories, ports, and communications networks, because those timelines will increasingly determine economic competitiveness. And if that prediction is right, then the line in our title stops being a joke. China deploys 5G in 6 months. America deploys a committee to study whether 6 months is fast enough. Funny. Until you realize committees don't produce network effects, engineers don't gain experience from meetings, and supply chains don't emerge from PowerPoint presentations. Infrastructure has a habit of rewarding the people who finish pouring the concrete first. If this topic has been sitting in the back of your mind too, stick around. We have a lot more strange numbers and uncomfortable comparisons to dig into.